Hey everyone, welcome back to part two of this session of this week. Previously we talked about a couple of basic building block. For example, you can type in Python code in a Python notebook, which we're gonna come back to here and execute the code here. On top of that, we talked about how to use ChatGPT to do the brainstorming session. Let's briefly go on to the top. We can start with a simple brainstorming question by saying, hey, what's some famous algorithm out there that can help me rate the validity of a chunk of string? And this chunk of string can simply be a URL, right? Website, things like that. And we talked about how after brainstorming session, you then can provide an actual use case, right? The use case here may be starting with some sort of user prompt, and then the chatbot is giving you some sort of response along with a website that you found online. And the question here is to recommend some sort of algorithm that rate this URL. With that being said, let's go down to the Python portion and let's see how we can implement this in Python environment. Right, so we're going to get a little bit technical by trying to understand what this function is doing first. So let's start with step one. Step one says fetch the page content, right? So right off the bat, it kind of makes sense because we provided a URL here because these URLs are kind of just the URL of the website. It didn't really tell us the content of that URL, right? What kind of content are we talking about? It's a blog, it's a paper, right? Is it coming from a credible source? We won't know that unless we scrape this website, right? So that will be step number one, which is to get the input, to get the content out of this website. So that is what the first step is doing, right? So it's going to use this package called Beautiful Soup, and then it's going to try to scrape the website by essentially making an API call, right? So it's going to send that URL into Beautiful Soup package, and then it's going to try to get something out. So this last step here, it actually says to extract paragraph text. So that is the scraping portion of what we want from that website URL, right? So that you can look into the website, you can look into the page content. You're not just stopping yourself at the address level. And then outside of the code, you have this try except statement. The try except statement is set up to allow this function to fail gracefully, right? If something fail, still, of course, it's a possibility that maybe some website they just don't allow you to scrape, right? That's certainly a possibility. So this try except statement help us to gracefully fail this function, right? So you're not running into a bug. So if something happens, you're just going to return an error code, right? So you kind of know what is going on. So step two, we want to check the domain authority, right? So domain authority, we're making an API called Moz API, right? And then here, the idea is to replace it with a local model, right? So here, the idea is to replace the actual Moz API, right? We can just kind of set up a default 60. You can kind of argue that this is hard-coded, right? It's not a real answer because we just kind of enter some random number in here. In reality, you're going to have to implement the API call, right? For the time being, we can just leave it at 60. It's hard-coded as a template, right? As a placeholder. And then for future reference, we're going to come back and we're going to perfect what we have here, right? Right now, it's just a random number. It's a random number for every single evaluation, right? For every single website. So it does not affect, right? It is no bias here. It's just a placeholder. So that's step number two. Step number three, we want to check the content relevance, right? So this is kind of like a very important step because you could have a website that's a legit, you could have a website that give you real information, that's truth information, that's just 100% facts, right? But if it's not relevant to what the user is asking, well, you kind of want to measure that, right? So that's what the step is doing here. So it's using this package called transformer, and then it's grabbing the model, right? The model that we talked about in first part of the session. We mentioned that you can go to Hugging Face, you can read about this paragraph of what the model is doing. You can test out what the model is doing, get some basic understanding using this inference provider. So you know that, hey, if you have a source function, so you know that if you have a source sentence that is a happy person, and you can compare that to 3, 4 different sentences, and you're gonna get a similarity score. So it kind of makes sense here because this is a happy person is very similar to this is a very happy person, right? Certainly it's more similar than happy dog and even more similar than sunny day. So you get the idea, and that's what the step 3 is doing. Step 4 is to fact check. And here we have a function here called check facts. So this is the helper function, check facts. As you can see, it takes text as the input argument. And the text here, it's some sort of paragraph or some sort of a string, right? And then it sends this string into this API as a query, and then it runs this API, and then it gets something back, right? It gets some claims back. So it returns 80 if found in a fact check database, right? It returns 40 if there's no verification. And it returns 50 if it's just default uncertainty, well, then you're kind of in the middle, right? So that's the logic of this function. Of course, it's just a template for time being. You can argue that this is not perfect. It's totally a fair argument. I'm not saying this is perfect, right? It is one way to check the facts, right? You run against the API call on whatever the query you have into this claim search API, and that's how you get some sort of basic score, right? It's just one measure of metric. So that's gonna give you a score. Since we're talking about 40, 80, 50, the data type is gonna be integer. So that is the structure of the fact checks helper function. So that finishes up step 4. It's gonna give you a score, and then let's continue, right? The next step is bias detection. Now, when it comes to bias detection, we use pipeline package that's directly hooking you up to Hugging Face. And then this is going to get you a text classification model with a particular model called Twitter Roberta base sentiment, right? So this particular model is actually going to give you a sentiment result. Either the prediction is positive or neutral or else, right? And then based on the label, right, positive, neutral, or else, you can then assign it as some sort of score, right? If it's positive, then it's 100, right? If it's neutral, it's 50, and then if it's else, then it's 30. So that's the logic of this function. So step 5, once again, it grabs the model from Hugging Face. So now this model is local, and then you can run through this sentiment pipeline that we just defined here, and then it assigns another score. Right, so that's step number 5, how biased this chunk of text is. Step 6, that's the last step. It's a citation check, right? So here we run a check Google Scholar against this URL, and then whatever count comes up, it's going to be a citation score. So let's talk about this function first, and then let's talk about how do we normalize this. So let's go down to the helper function, check Google Scholar, and then obviously here we need some sort of API key, right? So you have your API key, you can enter the params, right? And then you can run against Google Scholar. So the engine here is defined as Google Scholar. It is no different than if you go to Google Scholar website and type in some sort of keywords, right? So I can take you to Google Scholar. And I can just type in deep learning. That is essentially me trying to search deep learning as a topic in Google Scholar. So hopefully it gives me a list of papers, right? And then the list of papers obviously tells me how credible this topic is, right? Obviously, you want this list to be valid, and you want to have many papers talking about this topic so that you know that this topic is valid. It is indeed a topic out there in the literature, and then there are lots of people doing research on this topic. So that's how you know. So that is how. So that's how you know. Uh, so that's how you know where the function is coming from, right? So that you can get an understanding of, hey, we are really not doing much other than just making another API call against Google Engine, and that's pretty much it, right? And whatever the length is coming out of the organic results, meaning that however many literature that's coming up against the API call, well, let's just record that, right? And then if there isn't any, then obviously it's zero. So that is the structure of this helper function called check Google Scholar. It is making API call and it is giving us the number of citations. So with that being said, let's come back up. That wraps up the citation count from this helper function API call called check Google Scholar. After you get the count, you can probably normalize it, right? Because you don't want a count to be like 1,000 or 2,075, right? Like, you don't want that. You want to somehow normalize it so that it's so that it can be capped at 100, right? So if this is so you're taking the minimum number of the citation count times 10 and 100, meaning that if your citation count is 1, 1 times 10 is 10, then it's just 10, right? You're not taking 100 because 10 is less than 100. But if your citation is like, say, 20, 20 times 10 is 200, right? In that case, 200 is a larger number, then this minimum function is going to take 100, right? So if this number is greater than 100, it's going to take 100, meaning that you're capping the score at 100. So that's what this function means. And that wraps up step number 6, citation check. So now that you have all of the steps done, you just need to put them together, right? So last step, step 7, you compute the final score. So final score, you have to assign some sort of weights because remember what we talked about before, the final recommendation of the validity check function, right? Validity check score is W1 times this domain, W2 times the relevance score, W3 times fact checking, so on and so forth. There are 5 weights, right? W1 to W5. And then these weights can be tuned, right? It can be changed. So we have not talked about how to change it. That's okay, right? That's coming up next session. But you do need to know that these weights are assigned and they can be changed across domains, right? If you go from one type of function or one type of search query to another type of search query, of course, there's an argument here that says these weights should be changed. Certainly, that is one argument. We're going to come back to that and we're going to talk about how that can be changed. So once you put together this list of scores, assigning the weights, you can then just add them together and then it will just be basic mathematical algebra to give you a final score. So in the end, you return this and that's really it, right? You can of course add a sentence here called explanation by saying that, hey, we assign a score according to these weights, right? Something like that. I'll leave that to you guys, right? Explanation is whatever you interpret it. So I'll leave that to you guys, but the basic math template is here. So now that we know that this function is here, right? We can see this function here, we can copy it, right? So we know that the function exists. How do we test it, right? We don't want this just be a random output generated from ChatGPT, right? We actually need to be mindful about this code. We actually want to get into Python to test out this function, right? So to do that, I just need to press copy, and then I can go into my Python environment, literally just paste it down here. So I'm going to do Control V, and I'm going to paste a function here, and I'm just going to run it. And then as it's running, it might ask you for certain things, right? For example, it might ask you for the token. So let's give it a minute. One of the caveat for you to do is to be mindful of the API key. If you scroll down, there's a sample usage. And look at that. The user prompt is exactly what I just typing in the beginning. The URL for us to check is this URL that I provided. So if I say copy, and then I go back to my Python environment, I can physically execute the code on the spot. I want to be mindful of the API key. So it might pop out a question, say, hey, we want to access the secret called HF token. This is the token from Hugging Face. So we're going to say grant access, and then it's going to try to download the model, right? So if this is the first time you're doing it, I need to take you to Hugging Face while we're waiting for this. And then I need to show you where to find the token. So you go to huggingface.co, you have to set up account and log in. And once you log in, you have to go to your button on the top right corner, and then you have to find your API key. So you go to access token, and then you can enter password, and then you'll be able to find a token in there, right? So I'm gonna so this is the location of where you find your tokens. I'm not gonna enter my password here, but you guys get the idea. That is essentially where you find it. So once again, on top right corner, go down, hit settings or hit access token. That's where you find it. I think if you hit settings, you'll be able to find access token on the menu bar on the left-hand side as well. So that's how you find the token. You just need to copy that, and then you need to go to your Python, go to left-hand side, and then enter this key HF token and just paste your key in there. So that's how it's able to find it. And then one more thing I want to show you guys, it's a SERP API key. At the moment, this is a blank one, right? There's no key here. It's just hard-coded your SERP API key. Of course, I will have to enter it. So the way to do that is go to secret on the left-hand side, and then I will go down to find this Python code, copy it, right? And then I paste in here. All I gotta do from here is to get the SERP API name. So that's the SERP API name for that API key, and I have to assign it to this secret. So once I assign it, I have to, of course, say yes, right? Grant access, and then the variable is saved in here. Now, of course, I'm not going to show you guys what the key is, but I am going to copy it and enter it in here so that it gets that. So it's actually able to grab that secret and get that into the parameter and make that API call for me, right? Instead of assigning it as 0. So I'm going to rerun the cell, and then I'm going to go down here and rerun this result. And boom, there you go. You can see that the domain trust is 60, content relevance is 56, fact check score is 50, bias score is 30, and then citation score is 0, and then final validity score is 48, right? So in other words, in order to answer the user prompt, this reference, right, this URL that the search engine gave us only has a validity score of 48, considering all of the metrics that we talked about, right? So where does 48 come from? Well, it doesn't have a whole lot of citation, right? Pretty much 0 citation. It's not biased, right? Which is good. It does relate a little bit to the facts, right? Which is good. Not a whole lot, right? 50, not a whole lot, a little bit of effects. The content relevance is 56. Again, not that high, right? I'm talking about hugging my newborn after a flight, right? But the website is talking about travel with the newborn, right? So not really relevant. The domain trust is 60, is a little bit higher. So you can kind of think about it as, hey, maybe this website it's a bit more trustworthy, but not 100, right? 60 is not 100. So it's just relatively a bit more trustworthy, but not that trustworthy. So altogether, combining all these metrics, you can kind of say, hey, the final score is only 48. And based on this situation, I think it's probably a pretty reasonable score, right? Because I'm talking about holding my newborn after a flight, right? I'm not talking about traveling with a newborn. So even though this website might be a good place for me to read about, just to increase my knowledge, but it is not the question that I ask, right? So it kind of makes sense, right? It kind of makes sense, right? The score is not that high. So hopefully this gives you guys an understanding of what does it mean to rate an URL against the user prompt, right? And then hopefully this also sheds some light of what could potentially be a good way, right? A good structure, right? A good format for you to think about how to rate a URL, right? And then an important thing is you have to know your audience, right? You can't just rate a website based on nothing, right? You have to rate a website against what the user is asking, right? You have to know your audience, right? So I personally think the user prompt at the moment is probably going to be a requirement, right? You can't just grade a website as a website itself, right? You have to grade a website against the user prompt. So that's the structure that we're proposing here in this session. That's the structure that I'm hoping you guys can understand and you guys can all reproduce in terms of the submission. So the last few minutes, I want to show you guys how to make a submission, right? So, now we have a function. We test the function. Function generates some score for us, right? It says 48, right? So you can kind of say for the time being, this function has passed this unit test, right? We sending a user prompt, we sending a URL, it gave us a result, right? So this particular unit test, it's passed, right? It gave us something. Now it's time for submission. So we talked about GitHub repo in the first session. Now let's talk about how to get this code into the GitHub repo. So let's take you back to this repository called, this is a template repo, right? We talked about this in session 1. This is a repository. It is essentially a link on your account on github.com. GitHub.com is an open source code sharing platform. And this is where developers find and search code and develop code for their project. So what we're going to do is click on this green button, and then we're going to go to code spaces. And if you go to the first session video, you should know where the code space is because we talked about that in the first session. So you can click on that. So under code space, I have a link, and this is the link I set up last time, right? So if I click on that, it will take me to code space, which is the environment that we talked about last time. And then it's gonna automatically connect me with the current repository with a VS Code on the cloud, right? So once again, this is a VS Code on the cloud that is connected with the repository automatically, right? It is not a local VS Code. This is a VS Code on the cloud. And we talked about the folder directory. We have a projects folder. Under projects folder, we have project 1, right? And we have project 2. Project 1, we have a test code here that we talked about last time. And then we said that we can execute it. So for example, ls, you can list out what's inside of the folder. You can cd change directory to projects, and that will be able to navigate you to the projects folder, which you can see there's project 1, project 2. And then you can cd into project 1, and then you'll be able to see the test.py script. It's inside of there, right? You can also see on the left-hand side that the test.py is indeed in this project 1 folder. So now you can run it, right? Python test.py, and then it's going to ask you to enter an integer. That's the script that we talked about last time, which I'm showing you guys the code in front of me. For example, you can enter 2. It's going to ask you again, because the second line here, it's asking you input an integer, right? So you say 3, and altogether, answer is 5. So that is the environment. Now let's get this function in there. So we're going to go to our Python notebook. What we're going to do is we're going to copy paste the entire thing into this code space environment. And we're going to right click and say new file. And you want to make sure you're right-clicking on project one so that it's in the correct directory. And you can say deliverable one.py. This is going to give you another .py script. And you see that this color changed to green because there's a change in row repository, right? So all you gotta do is paste everything that we talked about in here. Now, one caveat you want to notice is this CPF is not defined. So you're gonna have to replace it with a string by saying your key here. So that is pretty much it about the script. Now, if you want to, you can enter the unit test as a separate script, or you can enter this directly in the bottom of this code, just like that. And if people execute the script, they will be able to see that you are entering the user prompt here, you're entering a URL here, and you are rating the URL validity against that user prompt. So this is pretty much all of the code that you need. And then on top of that, make sure that you don't forget the package. So if you scroll up a little bit in the beginning of the Python implementation, we have a step one to install the packages, right? So you can, of course, type this out in the requirements.txt file, but an easy way to do this is to say, highlight this entire thing, and then you see this quotation mark, right? It says reply, right? So you just kind of click on that and say, write all the packages here into a requirements.txt file for me. That's all you need to do. It will write the file in that format for you, just like that. So this is the list of packages I need, and then I just need to copy, right? So once I press copy, I will be able to copy every package required to run the code, and then I can go back to my VS Code. Again, go to my project one, right click, new file, and here I can type in requirements, make sure you have no typo, .text. It's going to open a text file, and then you can just paste the package in here. Once you paste the package in here, you get the idea, right? And obviously, you can install everything locally, and you can run the deliverable one.py. But of course, you don't have to physically run here because that's what the Colab environment is for, right? We just test it here, we know the code works, and we know the function runs as it is. So once you have this code here, and then once you have the requirements here, you can see that you have two files that the color is green. That means you have changes made in the repository that you have not uploaded online. All right, you have not saved it, right? So let's do that. Let's go to our terminal down here. Okay. So let's go to our terminal down here. So let's clean things up by pressing Control L. And then let's cd out of the directory of project one, right? So cd dot, that's going to take you a step up. You can verify that by printing out the working directory. This is a template repo projects. So you're inside the projects, right? So you got a cd again, and then print out working directory. Now you're in the main directory. You type out ls, you see projects and readme. Good. Now you can say git status. It's going to show you changes, right? Those are changes that you have not committed to the repo, then now you got to commit them, right? So the way to do that is git add dot. That means you are committing every single change. And then you say git commit -n. -n means you are writing a message. So this is basically a comment to tell people, right, that you are making the commit. So that if you do this, then I'm able to read that. I'm able to find the changes of your code so that I know where to look, right? So you can say, this is deliverable one for project one. Make sure you close the quotation mark. So this has to be a string. The string has to be double quotation mark. Make sure you close that. Now you just need to hit enter. And then you see that And then you see that it says, okay, 2 files being changed. There are a bunch of insertions that these things are created. Great. That means you have successfully committed the change, but you have not pushed it, right? So last step you have to do is git push. This will push everything from your local environment to the cloud. So you have to finish it. Git push, and then you are done. So now all of these code will be online. So now you can go to github.com and then say, this is a template repo. And then you can see that there's a comment here that says this is deliverable 1 for project 1. That makes sense because that is a comment that you just entered in your VS Code. So you go into project 1, you can see that this comment is only for project 1. And if you click on project 1 folder, you can see that this comment is only made for the script that you just created. So that this makes everything super clear. It tells me where it tells me where I'm supposed to be looking for. And if you follow the video, you will be able to create these 2 files on this repository. Now the last step is to take this URL and submit it. So take the URL, copy, and then now you can go back to your course repository and then scroll down to this link of submissions. So click on that link. And then you can, of course, fill in your name, course number, things like that, session number. I'll leave that to you. These are Q&A that's completely up to your own discretionary. Let me know what you like about the class. Let me know what you not like about this class, right? Things like that. So all that things is completely up to you. And then the only thing that's required for this submission is the GitHub URL, right? So all you gotta do is paste it here. And then you are done. You can then submit, and that will be the submission of deliverable 1 of project 1. So make sure you go to the video, pause if you need to, try to reproduce what the steps are. If you are able to reproduce what the steps are, you should be able to have your own repository, just like what I did here. You should be able to have your own .py script and text script on the repository, and you should be able to click in there and see that these code exist in there. And that's exactly what we talked about. Now, of course, you can take my code as a given, or you can use other question in ChatGPT, right? If you go to ChatGPT, like we talked about in session 1, there's a brainstorming session, things like that. You might find the code to be a little bit different here and there. That's okay. And that's because ChatGPT is generative LLM. That's because large language model is a generative model. It may or may not give you the same answer every single time. And that's okay. As long as you have the script online and that I can look at it and that I can run it, I'll be able to tell that you finished this assignment. So take that URL like we did here, right? The URL is on top. All you gotta do is put it here on the form and you are good to submit. So that's pretty much it for this session. I hope you like it. Hopefully this give you some insight of making API call, how does it work, a large language model, things like that. And hopefully this give you a basic idea of how to finish deliverable 1 of project 1.